You are an anarchist, whether you know it or not. And so, strangely enough, Amanda, myself, and Larken all know that we are, but you at home may not know that you are. So Larken is going to explain how you are already an anarchist. We're just going to bring it out of you today. So, Larken, what is the basis behind you thinking that everyone we interact with on a daily basis is already an anarchist, just like us weirdos?
Well, if you look at the way people think and act and talk and interact in their daily lives, with the exception of politics, the vast majority of people already understand that you don't attack people. That's not okay. You don't rob people. That's not okay. You can do almost anything you want if it's consensual and voluntary. You go to the supermarket. You don't say, I'm entitled to food. Hand it over, I'll shoot you. You say, here's some money, I'll trade it for that food. And then you trade it. That's a voluntarist act. People don't think of it that way because they don't need to, because that's just life. That's just how they see it. And so when most people ask, well, can you point to an example of anarchy in action? It's, most of your life, most of the time. Most of the way most people interact is anarchistic. The problem is that they've been taught to believe that in this certain realm, with certain rituals and certain documents, called politics, those rules don't apply. There's suddenly an exemption from morality, and, for example, where hardly anyone would feel okay about going to rob his neighbor at gunpoint to pay for his kid's education, most people feel perfectly fine about voting for a school board that will tax his neighbor to pay for his kid's education, doing the exact same thing, but in a way that they think is okay, because they're taught it's an exception. But it shows that in their real lives, they don't think like statists. They don't think, who can I rob to pay for the stuff I want? Who can I force to behave the way I kind of wish they would? They think like anarchists, which is, I'll leave people alone if they leave me alone. Live and let live is a completely anarchist concept. And different cultures have their own versions, but almost every culture has a version of the do unto others. Do unto others as you would have done unto you. Unless you would like to be attacked and robbed, that means don't be a statist, please. So yeah, that's how people naturally act, except in this weird realm called politics, where they're taught that there's an exception.
Well, I can just see Martin Minarchist saying, hey, I'm a nice guy, I'm a decent guy, I am very peaceful, I buy my food and beverage from the supermarket without a gun, I don't do that, but that's me, and I trust me, but I don't necessarily trust people I don't know, or people that I haven't met yet. So don't we need to be not anarchists in the realm of the people that we don't know, we might not trust?
The funny thing is, people assume that you must trust everybody if you don't want government, which isn't at all true. I don't trust anybody who's a statist, because they imagine that politics gives them a right to steal my money. Now, I was in a cage for a year because I didn't pay tribute to the U.S. ruling class. Almost everybody I know voted for that ruling class. Now, some voted Democrat and some voted Republican. They all knew that if their guy won, he was going to demand money from me and do nasty things if I didn't pay. So they did that to me. These people who think that they're peaceful and compassionate and stuff, and they are in their daily lives. But they imagine that, well, we need this because I don't trust people. And the ultimate irony is, if you believe in government, you're the one who can't be trusted. Because you're the one advocating violence against your fellow man. And to say, well, somebody might rob me, so I'm going to vote for this guy to rob everybody so that he can make a police force to protect me. Well, that makes you the guy who can't be trusted. That makes you the problem with society. And luckily, it isn't because they're evil. It's not because they run around doing that on their own, because they don't. It's just because they've been tricked into believing that, well, if you do it this way, through these rituals and these documents and in this particular way called politics and law and government authority, then it's okay. But I don't particularly care what your excuse is for robbing me. The threat to society is the people who think it's okay to rob others, and that includes absolutely everybody who believes in government.
I don't think Martin Minarchist would think that it's okay to rob you. I think what Martin Minarchist would say is that there are certain functions that only a government can provide, and in order to fund those functions, very essential functions like police or fire or courts or something like that. We need for you to pay your share in order to get these things that everybody wants. Everybody wants education. Everybody wants police. These are essential things for a functioning first world society. And so Martin Minarchist doesn't want to rob you, and he doesn't see it as theft. Like, taxation as theft is a weird concept to the Minarchist. And so if you're having this conversation with Martin Minarchist and you're trying to show him that he's just like you, how do you get him to see that you don't need robbery to get essential functions, and B, that taxation is in fact robbery, and because I don't think he's going to see that.
Yeah, and it's a great example to use to show the contradiction and hypocrisy that every statist does, and that I did for years and years and years when I was a statist. If someone came up to Martin Minarchist and said, I think it's really important that kids get a good education, and I'm not really sure that people would do that voluntarily, give me your money, I'm going to make sure they do it voluntarily. And even if they did it nicely and said, first I'll send you a letter asking you politely, and then I'll do a few other things, and then eventually men will come to your house with guns and kick you out of your house, and I'm going to take your house, because that's what happens if you don't pay property taxes. The sheriff will show up and steal your house. They'll show up with guns. Minarchists wouldn't do that and would recognize that as wrong, which means their moral code is perfectly fine. Their moral code is not quite knowing how something will work is not a good enough excuse to commit armed robbery.
Right.
But they've been taught to believe if you do it by way of elections, then it's okay, because that's somehow different. Well, the Constitution says Congress can tax. So, they're allowed to because some piece of parchment said they can for some reason. And so that doesn't count. And it's really just a matter of getting them to recognize that they've been tricked by mythology into betraying their own values.
Right.
Like Martin Minarchist, who wouldn't rob you by himself but will vote for somebody else to do it, and won't even see it as robbery. Like you said, he won't recognize it as theft because it's covered in all this mythology and these rituals, and we have these elections and appointments and this legislation and all these things to make it, and all the terminology. We don't call it robbery, we call it taxation and law and yada yada yada, to hide what it really is. And if you take away the euphemisms and the garbage that train people to not see reality, it's kind of hard to miss the glaring contradiction between being a decent person and believing in government, because they just don't match. And when people have to choose between them, most people will choose, I would rather not have innocent people be robbed. And the moment you would rather not have innocent people be robbed, you're an anarchist.
Well,
go ahead.
I would say that Stacy the statist would argue that you...
I was going to say Molly the Minarchist, but, go ahead. Stacy the
I
statist.
had to come up with a different word there.
Stacy the statist.
So she might argue that, of course, it's wrong to be robbed, but if you're not robbed by the government to pay for education and police and necessary functions, you will then, therefore, instead be robbed by your average Joe mafia man to pay for whatever it is that he wants. Because without government and police, there would be utter chaos. Of course.
Yeah, and again, these are excuses that come up. They're basically excuses that people fabricate to try to justify the contradictions in their own head. Because Stacy Statist would not use that argument in any context other than politics. She wouldn't go up to somebody and say, I'm sorry to have to rob you, but if I don't steal your money in order to hire this guy to protect you, somebody might rob you. Nobody is insane enough to think that in any context other than politics and government. So all of that kind of argument, and I've heard tons of statists say exactly that and use that as their argument, but it doesn't, because they never use it in any other context, it shows that they're fishing for an attempted rationalization of a belief system that doesn't make any sense and actually contradicts their, if somebody actually said, yeah, I'd rob you at gunpoint to pay for something, they would at least be consistent when they vote for government to do it. But the reason there's hope is because it's inconsistent, because Stacy Statist and Martin Minarchist wouldn't do it on their own because they'd recognize that as wrong. It's only when they're tricked into thinking it's okay when you do it by these magic rituals, that's what's pits us against each other. It makes, perpetual war among us, because then everybody's running to see who can be first to get the government to do what they want. Like, they're not running around saying, behave the way I want and give me your money, but they are running the government and saying, make her behave the way I want
it is
and
kind
give
of
me her money.
It is kind of ironic that people say, I need to rob you so that other people don't rob you.
Yeah.
Like, I need to do bad things because other people might do bad things. It doesn't make any real sense.
I think Stacey the Sadist would agree to that point, but she might also ask, are you saying that people are just good and will never try to rob you, and so we can just have no police and everybody would just be living in peace?
And if I'm feeling nasty, I'd say, you, Stacey Statist, I believe you are good if you will give up government and stop robbing me. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are other people out there who would actually rob me on their own, but they're a small minority. The number of people who will rob me by way of government is almost 100%. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, like you were saying, the weirdest thing is to say you need to be robbed in order to be protected from robbers. It's the most obvious contradiction there is. It's also the most common attempted justification for government, is because there are bad people out there. And it's not because I think everybody's trustworthy. It's not because I don't think nasty people are out there. But it's funny because when statists say that, they are acknowledging that theft is bad. We need to be protected from the people who would steal our money. And to start your solution with, so let's start by robbing people. No one would ever come up with that idea on their own. Nobody would start with that solution unless they weren't trained to imagine that a certain kind of that is okay.
Well, if Stacey believes that she's going to be robbed either way, in whichever world that we live in, government or no government, she might think it's a more peaceful robbery with the government and a more violent robbery with just the thieves on the streets. So is there anything you can say to Stacey the Sadist to convince her that despite there being some bad people that want to rob her without the government, that she will still be protected in other ways?
A couple things. First, I'd ask Stacey to please not rob me if she's concerned about people being robbed. Or please not advocate that somebody else robs me. The other one is when people talk about, I mostly want freedom, but there's a few things government just has to do. You want somebody to protect you. You want some organization. You want some, tough guys with guns to make sure you're not robbed. Which do you think will give you a better service? A, you go to them and they say, here's what we do, here's the price, whether it's you or your town or however many people who want to hire us to do this service, and you can decide if you want to purchase this service, and you can decide if you like it. You can quit and go ask somebody else. That's option one. Option two is, we're going to decide what to do for you. If anything, we decide the price. You don't have a choice. The latter being government. Now, why on earth would Stacey think that having no choice who to spend her money on to protect herself will work out better for her than protection in an anarchist society where she's allowed to hire people, you're allowed to cooperate, you're allowed to organize, you don't become government, you don't acquire a right to rob your neighbor. But the idea that government will ever serve the people better than freedom is saying, you being able to spend your own money, that's going to work out really badly for you. But me stealing your money and deciding how to spend it on your behalf, that'll be great. And that's the excuse for government. And if you just, that's not exactly advanced economics to know you'll get a better product if you get to decide whether to buy it and who to buy it from. But people are sort of taught that no, you can't be allowed. We have to have one big giant thing that we don't have a choice about. One big giant good guy to save the day.
Are there any final thoughts you have to Martin Minarchist or Stacey Statist that will show them that deep down that they are just like us and there's really not much separating us? In terms of our private daily lives, I think we all agree that we are the same as Martin Minarchist for sure. He's not, as far as I know, he's not going into a supermarket with a gun demanding tomatoes. So, final thoughts on everyone is an anarchist, they just don't know it yet.
I was a minarchist for many years, so I was what lots of people still are. And it wasn't because I was evil, and it wasn't because I wanted people robbed. And it was just because, and now I can look back and say it was because I was tricked into betraying my own values and my own moral code. And I would say to Martin Minarchist and Stacey Statist and anybody else who advocates government of any kind, of any flavor, of any size, get consistent inside your own head and you will end up an anarchist. And I got there by accident, by removing the inconsistencies and noticing, whoops, I turned into an anarchist. And it doesn't mean I throw bombs at people and break windows. It means I don't advocate violence against my fellow man. I only advocate force and self-defense. when you get to that point, you suddenly realize government can't be legitimate. And so I went through that process. I know a whole lot of other people who went through that process. And it wasn't because we turned evil and hated society. It's because we figured out peaceful coexistence is better than violent domination. How tough is it to figure that out? When you figure that out, you're a voluntarist.
Any final thoughts, Stacy?
No. Just that I'm not Stacy, because I would never say those things.
I'm never.
I think I want to wrap it up by saying that I see the only difference between us and your Martin Minarchist is that Martin Minarchist believes that the market works 95% of the time, whereas we here at this table believe that the market works 100% of the time. And so by market, we just mean voluntary interactions between peaceful human beings. And so markets produce bread, and they produce televisions, and they produce lots of wonderful things that we count on, iPhones and all that. And so if you think that it works 95% of the time, ask yourself why it all of a sudden fails miserably that last 5%. And I think you'll realize that you're a lot like we are at this table, and you'll become Larken the Anarchist and not Martin the Minarchist. So.
I did this post, and it was just basically the anarchist symbol, and it was a statement about what anarchy is. And I said something to the effect, if you think the assholes dressed in black burning shit down on TV are anarchists, you don't know anything at all about anarchy, something to that effect. And ended up with like 75,000 views and hundreds of comments and a bunch of triggered individuals, man. I mean, they were triggered by this because you're an idiot if you think anarchy can work. Well, as you saw if you looked at the title of this video, is you're probably an anarchist whether you know it or not. At least most of you are. At least in my audience. And even many people that consider themselves right-wing, small government, blah, 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 blah. If I ask you this simple question, there's two questions you can look at that will show that you're one degree or another of an anarchist. And one is, do you believe that taxation is theft? And that's an absolute. If you believe that, period, like there is no place for one person taking property from another person against their will through the use of force, then you are an anarchist. You just haven't figured out how it works yet. If you believe it's okay, I could debate that with you, but then maybe you're not an anarchist, right? I mean, that's pretty simple. And I would just say if you think it's okay, then I want to know this. How can a person, without a right, confer a right they do not have to another person? Because that's what voting is. If I don't have a right to come to your house and demand 15% of your shit, then I can't elect somebody to take 15% of your shit. Does that make sense? And all this social contract crap, I'm sorry, I wasn't there to agree to it. But let's take something a little bit easier to swallow for most people. If you believe in the basic principles of agorism, you're an anarchist. And that basic principle that I'm talking about today is, do you believe that two people have a right to trade with each other independent of any third party, if they want to? In other words, to make that really simple, do you think, let's say that you make really good cider and your neighbor grows a bunch of apples and your neighbor gives you apples and you give them cider, do you think that's okay? Or do you think that you should report that transaction to the Internal Revenue Service and pay taxes on it? Do you think that the Internal Revenue Service needs to know about that? Do you think the government needs to know about that transaction between you and your neighbor? No? Guess what? That's anarchism. And that's kind of my point today. I'm not an anarchist because I want to change the world to an anarchist, non-state. I'm not an anarchist because I want to impose my will of what I consider anarchy on you. I am an anarchist not because of how I think, but because of how I act, which is driven by how I think. And what I mean by that is plenty of things that I do, and probably things that you do every day, you could call very anarchist. When you're driving down the road and the speed limit says 55 and you're like, no, fuck that, there's no reason to do 55 here, and I don't think I'm going to get caught by a cop, and you drive 65, you're being an anarchist. You're choosing to not obey the rules set above you because you're not recognizing the authority of the ruler to impose that rule on you. Okay? And you might slow down if you think you're going to get caught, but that's no different than you might be a little bit guarded if you have to walk through a dark alley thinking somebody might rob you. You see how that works? Every time you do anything that the government says you're supposed to do a certain way and you choose not to, you're being an anarchist. And I am an anarchist in many ways as I can, not just through disobedience, but through lifestyle choices. Here's some examples. Number one, most people, the food you buy is almost 100% of it is subsidized by tax dollars. I've made a lifestyle choice. I don't consume grains. I only consume locally produced, grass-fed, etc. And therefore, the majority of the food I consume is not subsidized with tax dollars. That's an anarchist, conscious objection decision. Additionally, a huge portion of the meat that I acquire for my home, I barter for. I barter for it. I don't buy it. I barter for it. That's an act of anarchy because the system doesn't want that. I certainly don't tell the government, hey, I bartered for a steak today. That's anarchy. When I moved here, I sought a place to be as least dependent on the system as I possibly could. While I get electricity, and there is some subsidy in that, it comes from a private company, and I chose a competitive carrier, not the one the government said I had to. That's edgy, but it's, you could call it at least a little bit there. But I also chose a place where I have my own well, and I have my own septic system. I do not rely on the government for my waste or for my water. That's a decision. That's a conscious decision to do without government and to impose a private solution in my life. That's a choice. That's anarchy. Where I live, I also chose a place where, guess what? We have no government-provided garbage removal. How would you ever get rid of garbage? It turns out there's people who will voluntarily come get your garbage and take it away for you if you pay them money voluntarily. You don't actually need a third-party intermediary like the government. I'm an anarchist by using cryptocurrency, specifically privacy coins like Monero and R. If I have to explain to you how that works, you don't really know what cryptocurrencies are or Monero and R are, and that's not what today's subject is about. But by doing business in a completely private way, where transacting business is only between two people with no third-party intermediary and no reporting to the government, that's as anarchist and as agorist as fuck. See, so now I know what some of you are going to say, but you used the roads. You used the roads. Okay. You want to do a purity test? How about this? Do you ever cheat on your taxes? Okay, you don't pass the purity test. Do you ever speed when you're in your car? Okay, you don't pass the purity test. Do you ever conduct barter without reporting it to the government? Okay, you don't. See how that works? See, we got to stop thinking in this binary, like, ones and zeros world that we live in today. On, off, 1, 0, on, off, 1, 0. No. It's like a dimmer switch. How much of this can you incorporate into your life? I live as anarchist as I can in the world that I live in with an expectation that there are certain things I need to do to protect myself. And again, if I'm walking down the road and somebody robs me, and instead of being able for me to draw down on them, they have, there's a guy there, a guy behind me, and a guy over there, and all of them have a gun pointed at me at the same time, and they say, give me your wallet, and I know if drawing my weapon, I'm going to die. I got no choice. I'm going to give them my wallet. That does not mean that I see them as legitimate authorities in my life, and that's the big one. I deny the legitimacy of the state. That's what makes me an anarchist. Not because, I want to, you know what? If you want to live with Nancy Pelosi as your Speaker of the House, you get to do that. I'm an anarchist. I don't have the right to take that away from you. Do you see how that works? If you want to live with a boot on your throat, you have every right to live with a boot on your throat. I have every right to resist it. That's what anarchism is. It's not these jackasses on TV throwing shit through windows and people say, well, what would you do about that in anarchy? If it was an anarcho-society, those people would have got shot in the face the day that shit started and those cities would not have burned. That's what would have happened. Because the right to your property is seen as valid. The peaceful, rightful property holdings that you have to be respected. And people that don't respect that, they say, well, they're leftist anarchists. They're anarcho-communists. Sorry, guys. That's not a thing. That's not a thing because you can't impose your will on others through force and be an anarchist because you're violating what's known as the non-aggression principle. And how are you going to impose your will on others to create a communist society without a state? You can't do it. You need a state to do that. If you have a state, you're not an anarchist. See how that works? I know they call themselves anarchists. I know it's generally recognized in the intellectual school of thought that there are, communist anarchists. And I'll tell you how communism anarchism works. I just haven't ever met a communist anarchist that's okay with this. Maybe a few of them are out there somewhere. I don't know. You do you, and I'll do me. If socialism is an adjective, rather than a system imposed from a hierarchy, I have no problem with it. If you and all your buddies want to form a commune, if you want to form a collective that is beyond borders, with economic agreements between yourselves, and as long as you voluntarily engage in that, go ahead. Now, I'll tell you why they don't ever want to do it. They don't ever want to make the agreement back, like, so then I can go out and do all my anarcho-capitalist stuff if you feel the need to put a label on it, because they know it won't work for them. And they know it will work for me, because here's the final thing on how I know most people are anarchists at heart, and it is agorism that tells us this. Everything that we look at politically in general, it requires the imposition of a system by some form of authority to make it run. So taxation requires imposition. All right? Here we go. Agorism requires nothing but human beings left to themselves. You cannot show me a group of people anywhere in any condition at all ever that didn't engage in trade and commerce. Little kids set up lemonade stands. You put people in prison, they still engage in commerce when they're not supposed to. Even when the system imposes a barrier to commerce, we as humans conduct commerce. Unlike most principles that we have in the world today that we see as, well, it came from God or it was ordained with this. We created all these systems. We made all these systems. We invented all these systems. Agorism was not invented by humans. It is what humans do. Put two kids together in a room, give them a stack of baseball cards, and see how long it takes before they start trading. And they don't need a third party. If you don't think you need a third party to conduct commerce, you're an agorist, and if you're an agorist, you're an anarchist. I know that may be hard to believe, but just because you don't know how to make it work yet doesn't mean it isn't what you really believe at your core. Do you believe that you can convey a right you do not have? If you say no, you cannot convey a right you don't have, you can't defend voting and you can't defend the state. You're in conflict with yourself.